So we need to fix the problem that we have with our tests in our handler package. And let's run those tests again. And this time I'll run them right in the handlers directory, so those are the only tests that I'm running. Go test. And if I look at the beginning of this, right at the very top, just after I ran the tests, which is right here, you'll see that it's telling us we have an error in handlers.go line 65. So let's go look at handlers.go and see what's going on. Handlers.go line 65. There we are. So line 65 is helper server error cannot get reservation from session. And if you look at all of the errors that were generated there, you'll quickly discover that every single one of them has to do with the fact that it can't get information from the session. So clearly we have a problem here. So let's go look at the actual tests themselves and see how they work. So handlers.test, the one that we're dealing with, is calling the reservation, and that's this one right here, make reservation. So make reservation is the route that is failing, and it's not passing any post data. It's looking for an HTTP status OK, and that's the URL that it's calling as a GET request. So if we actually look at the handler itself, again, this is the function that is causing us the problem, and the problem is it can't get the session. Well, these tests are set up using setup test, this file right here in the handlers folder. Let's see if we're doing anything with the session there. So it looks like we have our imports, we declare some variables, and then we have this function getRoutes, and that's what's called, right in the tests, that's what's called before these tests run. So if I look at the handlers test, what I'm doing is calling getRoutes, setting up a server, and then just running my tests. So it's not getting the session. And why not? Because at no point do we ever put anything in the session. We need to have access to our request variable. Well, we have a request, there's no problem there, but we're not actually putting anything in that request to pull out in that handler. So we need some means of doing that. So what I'm going to do right now is just comment all of this stuff out. And I'm going to comment it out just so these tests don't run at all, because this is now an empty slice. It will never run anything in test handlers. And what I'll do instead is come down here and write a test specifically for the availability. So how are we going to do that? I'll create a new function, func, and it will be called test repository reservation. So that's the test I'm going to run. But before I do that, I need to have access to a request variable that I can put a sessional variable in before I call that handler. So I'm going to go back to my setup tests, and I'm going to make some changes here. First of all, I'm not going to use just the getRoutes function. Instead, we'll take advantage of that test main function that we used in our other tests. So I'll create a function called test main, which is what it has to be called in this instance, because this is part of the testing package available to us in the standard library. And it takes one parameter, which I'll call m, and it's of type testing.m. And it doesn't return anything. And then I'll grab the things out of getRoutes that really belong in that test main function anyway. And that's everything up to and including the renderers. So I'll cut them out of here. I'll paste them into here. And then, of course, we need to have that os.exit and run the test just before you die, before it exits running. So that should be os. All right, so now we have a test main function. And it seems that I have an error here. Oh yes, gob.register. Let's just... Yeah, it didn't do the import for us. So I'll just force it to do the gob.register. That'll force it to re-import it into our imports, and the error should go away. And it does. So now functionally I've changed nothing. I've just made it run the setup in a test.main function, and we still have this getRoutes, which we may or may not use. We'll find out in a little while. So let's go back to our tests and see what we can do to make this test actually passed. So what I want to do first of all is look at the reservation handler itself. So let's go back to handlers. It's expecting to pull a models.reservation out of the session and store it in this variable. Okay, so we need to have a models.reservation to put in the session. Well, we know how to do that. That's easy. Let's just create a new variable called reservation. It's going to be assigned the value of models.reservation, and I'll put just enough information in this variable to be able to actually deal with it in the reservation function in our handlers. So we need a room ID, and we'll just use 1, which is the general's quarters. And we also need the room, which is of type models.room. We need the name and the ID in that. So that's going to be of type models.room. And inside of that, we will populate its ID, which is 1, and its room name, which is general's quarters. So I need a comma there, and I need a comma there, and this should be a colon, not a comma. So now we have a reservation variable, and now we need to put that in the session somehow. So let's get a request. We know how to get a request, and potentially an error, which I'll ignore, or assign the value of http.newRequest. And the method is going to be get, just like it is in the roots, and the URL will be the same one we used in the roots, make-reservation. And we'll pass an empty body. So that's not HTTP test. We're going to use HTTP new request. There we are. So now we have a request, and we need to put that in to the request. We need to put our reservation variable as a sessional variable into the session of the request. And of course, you do that using the context. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, what I'm going to do is create a new function down here, which I'll just call get CTX, and it will take a request, which is a pointer to an http.request. And it's going to return a context, context.context. So what we're going to do is essentially get a context, put our sessional variable in it, and then store that in our request. In order to do that, the context has to have a particular value in there, a key, something that our session package knows is the session. Fortunately, that's pretty easy to do. So what I'm going to do is, in this function, I'm going to create a context and potentially an error by calling session.load, which is built right into our session package. And we've done this before. Session.load. It requires a context, which will be from the request that we've just passed this, request.context. And it requires a header. So what we're going to do is get a header from that context, or from that request. Request.header.get. And the header key is exactly like this. And uppercase and lowercase matter in this, I think. We're going to do it that way just to be absolutely safe. We'll check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, we'll just log the error. So log.println the error. That's all we'll do there. And then we'll return the context. But this context, we actually know about the header X session, which we need in order to read from or write to the session. So back in this function, test repository reservation, we have our request. Now we need to get our context into that request. So we'll get a context like this. CTX is assigned the value of get context. And we'll pass it the request we just made. So now we have a context that we can actually add to our request. And we do that the same way we did the last time we wrote this sort of test. Request is equal to request with context, the context we just created. So now we have a request that knows about the X-session header. So now we can do something with it. So what's the next step? The next step is a little different, something you haven't seen yet. We're going to take advantage of something that's built into the testing package of Go called a new recorder, an http test.newRecorder. So what I'm going to do is create a new variable called RR for request recorder. That's going to be assigned the value of http test.newRecorder. And this is exactly what it sounds like. We can actually look at the description of it. A new recorder it returns an initialized response recorder. So this is basically simulating what we get from the request response lifecycle when someone fires up a web browser, hits our website, gets to a handler, passes it a request, gets a response writer, and the response writer writes the response to the web browser. This fakes that entire process, or the part of it that we need for a recorder. So we have a response recorder here. We're not using it yet, so we have to. What we're going to do now is put our reservation in the session. Session.put, just like we do in our actual handlers, but instead of using the context from our request, we're going to use the context we've built. CTX, name it reservation, and pass in our reservation. So now we've added that reservation variable defined up here with all of these values to our context. We've put it in the session, in effect. And what we want to do now is actually call our reservation function, which is a handler. Well, we can't call it directly unless we do something to it. I'm going to take that handler, reservation, and turn it into a handler function. So I can do that really easily. So I'm going to say handler, which is going to be just a variable. That is assigned the value of our reservation, but I'm going to cast it to an HTTP handler function, http.handlerfunc, and I'm just going to put in repo.reservation. So what I've done now is take our reservation variable, or function, which is right here. It takes a response writer and a pointer to a request, and I've turned it into a function that I can call directly. So let's go back to our handlers test and actually call that function. And we do that simply by saying handler.serveHTTP. And what I'm going to put in there for its function, for its request and response, are our request recorder, or sorry, response recorder, and the request that we've built. So when I do that, I can actually call that directly. I'm actually calling serve HTTP on this just as I call it on all of our routes in the main function of our application. Simply because I've built a request, put that sessional variable reservation into the session, cast my reservation handler into a handler func. Now it has serve HTTP, because that is one of the things that this satisfies all the functions necessary to become something that actually acts as a web server. So I don't even need my routes for this test, so I don't never call get routes at all. Instead, I'm building it manually, calling this directly by calling handler serve HTTP, passing it my response recorder, and passing it my request, which has the necessary sessional information in it. So at this point, I can actually see if this test passed by saying if my RR, my response recorder, if its code is equal to http.status_OK, then it's passed. If it's not true, so this should be a not equal, if it's not equal to true, then I fail my test. T.error, and I'll use error F in this case, and I put my string in here. Reservation handler returned wrong response code. Got %d wanted %d. And then I replace those placeholders with got rr.code wanted http.status_OK. Okay, so this will probably work. Let's find out. Let's go back to our terminal, clear the screen, and run the tests. Go test. Okay, it passed. Let's make sure it's actually passing. Let's change this back to an equal. This should fail now. Let's clear our screen, run the test again, and it failed. So now we have a means of putting something in the session and pulling something out of our session. And this is a good start. So what we'll do in the next lecture or two is begin to create tests for all of the routes in our handlers that use the session. And then we'll improve those tests by changing our test database repo to respond differently based upon the kind of information we pass it in our tests. And we'll do that in the next few lectures.